Good afternoon. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar on storytelling. I'm excited that you've tuned in. Since this is a webinar on storytelling, I thought I would begin with my story. My name is Rani Sanderson, and my preferred pronouns are she and her. My original background was in film and video art, but after several years working in the industry, I decided to change it all up. I came from a family with a strong social justice background, so I decided to go back to university to pursue a Master's of Environmental Studies, where I concentrated on education and community arts. I figured I would find new outlets for my creative and technical skills, assuming that I would do documentary work. But my professor, who is quoted here in this slide, actually, introduced me to digital storytelling, and everything just fell into place. This was the perfect way to consolidate all my skills and passions. So I went out to Berkeley, California to train at the then Center for Digital Storytelling, which is now Story Center, and have been practicing as a facilitator ever since. At Story Center in the US, which has been around for over 25 years, they are the pioneers of this method of digital storytelling. And after collaborating with Story Center on a few projects, in 2015 they asked me to start up Story Center Canada. So while we specialize in digital storytelling, we also do a lot of other story-based work. For those of you who aren't familiar with digital storytelling, in a nutshell, digital storytelling is a community arts practice rooted in first-person narrative, where small groups of people come together in a workshop setting to share their personal stories and create 2 to 4 minute short videos, illustrated mainly with their own personal archival photos and video clips and additional materials created specifically for their story, which can include photos, video, sound, music, or any other artwork. And I will be showing you a few along the way, so you'll get an idea of what I'm talking about. So storytelling is a great way to explore a wide diversity of experiences, bringing awareness to issues through personal reflection, connect people through shared experiences, particularly in communities or with individuals who have historically been marginalized. Sharing stories in groups allows people to hear and be heard and to bear witness. So this is what I'm sort of going to do in this presentation today. I'll give a brief overview of storytelling practice, and then the bulk of the presentation will focus on how stories can be used. So you're either interested in or have been collecting stories from your organization or community. So what can you do with them? As part of this, we'll go over some of the ethical concerns of telling and listening to stories, collecting and using stories, and sharing stories more widely or publicly. And finally, we'll discuss how stories can be used in various ways for various purposes. And at the end, we'll have time for a short Q&A. So stories can be used for all kinds of purposes. You can be telling the story of your organization in order to bring awareness to an issue, educate on a certain topic, and it's advocacy work, or for funding purposes. I just want to say that I specifically work in and will be speaking about personal narratives, not documentary or journalistic style storytelling. And I'll go over for reasons why during the presentation. And while I specialize in digital storytelling, as I mentioned, most of what I'll say is transferable and applicable to any kind of storytelling, whether you choose to do digital storytelling, written stories, blogs, podcasts, photo voice, orally shared stories, or any other form of story work. So I want to start by showing you a story. And keep in mind all the stories I show because I'll refer to them later in the presentation. So this first one that I'm going to show you is Michelle's story called Belonging. It was made in a public workshop last year in Toronto, and it's a story about how Michelle, who is a professor at St. Mary's University in Calgary, how she's connected to her people, her history, herself, and her work. So I'll just play the story now.
The fire burns. It's been burning all along while I slept. I tiptoed to the fire of my ancestors and poked at the embers. I stirred. Who do you think you are? I am the one. Yeah, right. What do you know? I know that I don't know, and that I want to learn. More. For myself. For the 7 generations before me and after me. For my grandfathers and grandmothers. They are waiting. Their stories are stuck in my throat. The fire is burning. Where do I begin? Yes, I hear you. As through the embers, I visit fires. My roots stab the earth, moving east and east. They know the way. Always have. Back to the fire. Speak. Sing. Laugh. Wake up. Oh, you're all here. Have been all along. As I've been searching, you've been waiting. Patiently waiting for your stories to be found. I've picked us some blueberries. I've got lots of wood. I am the one. I'm learning what it means to be a lodgekeeper. I'm learning that there is nothing more important than our relationships. To one another, to the land, to our past, and to the ones who are yet to come. I am learning that everyone wants to be a part of something bigger than themselves. I am learning what it means to carry Indigenous and settler blood in my veins. I am learning that my ancestors are always with me, and that I am guided by their love and storied lives not yet spoken. I am learning about what it takes to prepare a lodge, and how to pray for it so that all of those that will come to it will find their place at the fire. I am finally learning about what it means to accept my place of belonging as a guest on this land, in this generous, abundantly loving, welcoming place.
So normally I do these presentations in a room that are full of people, and then we can discuss the stories after, but as this is a webinar, you'll have to settle for listening to me talk about it. But if you do have any thoughts or questions about this or any of the stories I show, please keep them and we can discuss them during the Q&A at the end of the presentation. So I show this story for a few reasons. One, it's a very personal story, yet it tells the work that Michelle does in her faculty, how she is connected to her work, and why she feels her work is important. It's a different type of storytelling, so not all stories need to subscribe to a Western style of storytelling, and some cultures tell stories very differently. You have to let people tell stories in a way that works for them, in ways that are authentic to who they are and the communities that they belong to and serve, which I will sort of mention a few times in this process. You can imagine a series of stories made by various people connected to this faculty, professors, admin staff, students, which could work together to give an overview of the program offered and the, if you will, culture of this faculty. I did a project with a small charter school in New Jersey last summer doing just this, and they will use their stories on their website to make their school stand out. So they had stories by educators, other teachers, some staff, and the principal, and they wanted to give an overview of what the school is all about, how it focuses on social justice work and community service in order to enroll and get interest from new students. So why storytelling? So you don't have to be an anthropologist to recognize that stories are universal. People everywhere tell them and listen to them, of course, in a variety of unique ways, in order to understand themselves, their communities, and the larger world. A good story has power. It has the power to inspire and move people to action. Good stories have the power to build understanding, change ideas, and teach. Stories can bring a face to statistics and numbers and humanize an issue. Most importantly, good stories have the power to be remembered. We learn much faster and easier if information is delivered in story form. You've probably been to a conference or heard a lecture and been shown an impressive array of statistics, charts, and figures, which definitely have an impact and are important, but those numbers are difficult to remember. But if you hear a personal story that goes with those numbers, it's much more likely you'll come away with a memory of that story and that experience, and then remember the overall message. People connect to an authentic personal story. So while people may not have experienced the same thing as someone else, everyone has experienced the same emotions. Emotions are universal. We've all experienced joy, sadness, loss, excitement, anger, fear, happiness, and so on. So if storytellers are truthful in how they express their emotions, This is what readers, listeners, and or viewers will connect with. So the best stories convey emotional truth. Community storytelling is a powerful methodology to enable marginalized voices, including women, girls, youth, LGBTQ+, indigenous communities, newcomers, refugees, survivors, and more, to reflect on their experiences and help them understand who they are. And stories are democratic. They lessen distance between, quote, expert and audience. They don't tell us what to do, they tell us what it was or is like. When we give people the opportunity to tell, share, and listen to one another's stories, they take ownership of their experiences and discover what they have in common. This can create solidarity and give people the tools and confidence to become change agents and leaders in their communities and help in the effort to raise community awareness and participate actively in social change. Regardless of what particular format is used or how stories are produced and shared, and beyond all the current buzz around storytelling that seems to be circulating in the nonprofit and grassroots world, what can we say about the kinds of narratives that are especially compelling for nonprofits and social change work? Before I go on, though, I do want to say this. I've seen charts and websites about what makes a good story, lists about what to include, how to structure things, but as I said earlier, please keep in mind that not every culture conforms to a Western sensibility of storytelling, and that you should allow people to tell stories that work for them, that fit with their community, culture, personal authenticity, and etc. This is part of practicing cultural humility. It's a perpetual challenge for grant makers and recipients to capture and convey the value of their work. Metrics and statistics are important, but they are hard to engage and connect with and very impersonal. Stories can foster empathy and enable people with different points of view and different ways of thinking and believing to discover their shared values and connect and see the world through someone else's eyes. It's important for you to decide what form of storytelling will work best for your purposes. Where are you going to share your stories? What suits your needs best? A written story like a newsletter or blog post or something like this? A video like a digital story or documentary style video or interview piece? A recording of a story, a live telling of a story, either on radio or podcast or in person as a presentation, a performance, etc. So once you've identified where you would like to show your stories, you can decide what type of story will suit that best. Albert Einstein puts it well, saying, "Not everything that counts can be counted, and not everything that can be counted counts." Some storytelling for nonprofits is geared more towards telling the stories of the organization, but the way I practice, I concentrate more on telling those organizational stories through the personal stories of the individual, either who start, run, or work for nonprofits, or of the communities and people they serve. A personal story can be a bridge between individual experience and collective action. So through these personal stories, you can get a great overview and insight into the organization itself. So I'm not talking about interviewing people and then basically reinterpreting their stories in my own words or point of view. I'm talking about having people tell their own stories in their own voice. This makes for a more honest story. Plus, it allows storytellers to trust that their story will be exactly as they want it, that they will have control over how they are represented. They will be more likely to trust you and feel like that your input and viewpoint and story are valid and worthwhile, especially in more marginalized communities who traditionally may not be given a platform to voice their ideas, opinions, or even just be who they are authentically. It puts the power into the hands of the storyteller, as opposed to in the hands of, say, a writer or editor or filmmaker. As a story facilitator, you may have to ask questions and give some prompts to get a story going, but ultimately, this is the storyteller's story. To get an organization's story, you might ask fairly open-ended questions. How did this organization get started? What is unique about your organization? What are you proud of that your organization does, etc. But to get a more unique and personal story, one of several that could work together to give a fuller overview of what your organization is all about, ask people more directed, personal questions that will shine the light on them, not the organization. The organization's story will shine through in the collection of the smaller individual stories. For example, ask people, describe a time when you felt you made a difference working with this organization or group or people, whatever works for that. Who influenced you the most when you were younger? What is the moment when you realize that this is the work you should be doing? Considerations will come up throughout this presentation, particularly in the ethics discussion later on, but here are just a couple things to think about as far as an approach to storytelling work. The story-based approaches and practices we use at Story Center all have great reverence for the value of personal stories rooted in lived experience and told in first-person voice. Working with trained facilitators is important. They're able to assess and analyze community strengths and needs, ask the right questions in terms of language capabilities, grasp the nuances of complicated health or human rights issues, and then filter all this in light of strong commitment to ethically sound methods, determining how a particular kind of storytelling workshop will work for each organization or group of people we might be working with. So now I'm going to show you a second story. This is Adeline's story. It was made recently in a workshop with refugee and newcomer Latinx transgender women in collaboration with the Center for Spanish-Speaking Peoples Trans Latina Ontario group. The group made stories to showcase their experiences of being transgender. So again, keep this story in mind for the upcoming discussion points, which we'll go over soon. So here is Adeline's story.
This was probably the most polite and generous kid ever. I would know. Naturally, they made sure to please the people around them. They thought that was ideal. However, this mindset, mixed with confusion over feeling different, manifested a life of constant fear. Fear of being rejected or denied. This is a costume. A portrayal of not wanting to bother anyone, if anything, trying to please everyone and living of that acceptance. Integrating into the commonly accepted archetype of a man surely has advantages that come with it. However, is being someone great worth putting aside oneself? I hated the way my body was changing, but I was told it was meant to be empowering. I started to get lost in what I was supposed to be. My confidence was almost non-existent. During this time, I was the most fragile I've ever been. Even though this was me, I don't know how to refer to this person. He was never real. Eventually, it all came to the point where that kid stopped holding back, slowly stopped filtering themselves. Constantly feeling jealous of what I was not was a clear sign. I knew what I wanted to do, what I wanted to be. I just needed the time to gain the courage. He found himself within her, free to be herself, to express and represent her true personality. I don't think I was born into the wrong body, or born into wrong anything actually. Technically, yes, I would love to have been born differently. Things would be much easier for me. However, I'd like to believe that like you and everyone else, I was born into my own individual and personal journey. I can honestly say that I'm now more comfortable and confident within myself than I've ever been. If things were different from the start, perhaps I wouldn't be as strong as I am today. I would not be me.
So Adeline and the rest of the group are using their stories to take around to universities and other lectures and film festivals to help change the narrative around how people think about transgender people. So you've got all those stories collected. Now what do you do with them? So again, I normally do an activity around this when I have people in the room, but since this is a webinar, I'm just going to continue discussing these points with you. As you watch this story and the next one and the previous ones, I want you to keep in mind these two things, and then we'll discuss the ethical considerations of using this type of story and how an organization might use this story. So now I'm going to show you Chishimba's story, When Silence is Not Golden. So I have a trigger warning here It does contain some content about sexual abuse. It's not overly graphic, but may be upsetting to some people. So please feel free to mute or, walk away for a couple of minutes during this. The story was created through a collaboration of Story Center's Silence Speaks initiative and Jon Snow Inc. as part of the Innovation Challenge to prevent HIV among girls and young women in East Africa. So again, there's a trigger warning. It may be a few upsetting things to some people. But while you watch this again, I want you to think about the ethics of making and using this kind of story and how an organization might use it. So here's Chishimba's story.
I was 11 years, too young to know much about sex, but old enough to have breasts. I was at home with my baby sister and my 23-year-old cousin. My parents were at work. I was alone in my room when my cousin walked in and started fondling my breast. I was terrified. There he was, someone I trusted and looked up to, shamelessly enjoying himself. He said, "Do not tell anyone." When my parents came home that evening, I was afraid of causing conflict. How could I tell them he had touched me in ways I hated? I had no witness except a 3-year-old who could barely construct sentences, so I kept quiet. It happened again the next day, this time lasting longer than before. Still, I remained silent, fearing the consequences of speaking out. I wondered, will anyone believe me? What if he comes back again? When will this end? Even though I just wanted to forget about it, I couldn't bear the thought that my cousin might do the same thing to my sisters. I finally found the courage to tell my parents the truth. Much to my relief, they believed me. When confronted, my cousin denied everything, saying, "Why would I touch her? I'm old enough to have any lady I want, so why would I be wasting my time with a child?" But a year later, he finally admitted it. Today, I'm committed to helping fellow survivors and bringing attention to the realities of sexual abuse. I'm now mentoring adolescent girls and young women, helping them find inner strength to challenge and overcome abuse and discrimination. It is so important for them to feel safe speaking out so justice can be served. I am Chishimba Kasanda, and I dream of a world where young women and girls can safely speak out about abuse and get justice.
So I'm going to go over ethical considerations of doing storytelling work and connect it back to the story we just watched, plus the other two. But of course, this applies to any kind of storytelling work you might do. At all Story Center workshops, and hopefully in any storytelling workshop or story and gathering method you choose to host or undertake in your own organization or work, we ensure we practice in an ethical and respectful manner. First of all, as a facilitator, I'm always aware of my own experiences and position of power and authority. As a white, straight, cisgender female engaged in working with individuals and communities who typically possess far less privilege than I enjoy, I work through the lens of cultural humility, which means asking not how others' differences from me inform who they are, but instead examining my own location vis-a-vis race, gender, and class influences my perspective and ability to listen, understand, and act. It is of the utmost importance to protect the storytellers. Creating a safe space is one way we do this. We always begin our workshops at Story Center with a story circle, where everyone is given uninterrupted time to share her, or his story and receive feedback. In setting up the story circle, we ensure the entire process is a safe space, and we work as a group to devise a set of guidelines to create that safe space. I suggest using only highly highly skilled facilitation appropriate for the level of support needed in a workshop for language challenges, computer use, cultural appropriateness, and emotionally difficult subject matters. This may include having social workers or other support staff on hand for more vulnerable groups, and then the storytellers can decide whether they want these people in the room during the process or just outside and available for them if and as needed. So in the examples all above that you've seen, Chishimba and Adeline, they would have taken part in a story circle to orally share their stories before writing and recording. All participants would have agreed on the guidelines for the story circle and for the workshop in general. And for any kind of storytelling work, it is necessary to make the storytellers feel safe, comfortable, and supported throughout the entire process, whatever that might be. So consent is a huge deal. We want to make sure everyone is fully aware at all times of the consequences of sharing stories, particularly vulnerable stories. In the end, in workshops I run anyway, storytellers are the owners of their stories and can choose whether or not they wish to share those with Story Center or anyone else. I'd rather have people make the story they want or need to make and then decide afterwards if they feel comfortable sharing. And people can choose how to share, either for workshops and conferences or educational purposes, and then there's another level of sharing which is wider online. If for some reason we work on a project with an organization or funder who insists stories be made public, which is very rare, then storytellers are told this up front, and we work with them throughout the workshop to ensure that they are creating something that they will feel comfortable sharing, and constantly checking in with them about the materials and the choices that they are making. And then personally, I like to get in touch with storytellers every time I choose to share their story. So for these I showed today, I got in touch to make sure they were still okay with me sharing their stories, because people can change their minds, circumstances can change, and in some cases, what was once okay may no longer be, for valid reasons. Storytellers have the right to freedom of expression in representing themselves in their stories. As facilitators, we provide storytellers with the space and flexibility to describe what they have experienced within the parameters of or thematic concerns of a given project, and without being coerced or censored, as well as assist storytellers in determining whether or not it is safe for them to attach their names to their stories, and whether images of themselves or others should be blurred to protect their privacy and maintain their safety, or even their voices. Any story can be created anonymously if that's what makes the storyteller feel most safe and comfortable. Projects must be sensitive and appropriate to local contexts and needs. Facilitators should work with local partners to develop and carry out realistic plans for storytelling, recruitment, and advanced preparation. We conduct workshops in local languages with the help of interpreters where needed, and adapt workshop methods to fit local technological resources and capacities, emphasizing always the importance of first-person voice, group process, and the participatory production. So this one is about informed choices. We are committed to assisting storytellers in making content decisions that ensure their dignity and safety, and where needed, protect their privacy. Ethics must be viewed as a process rather than a one-off occasion of gaining consent. Ongoing dialogue between storytellers, staff members, and partner organizations or institutions about how best to design and implement an ethically responsible project is key to ethical practice. We perform ongoing communication with storytellers to address concerns that may arise for them following a workshop, and to involve them in story distribution strategies if they so desire. So we make sure everyone understands the implications of making their stories public, whether that means putting them on the internet or showing them in a public screening like support groups or conferences, or in this case, a webinar. So even though many individuals or groups are making stories to affect social change initiatives, they may find in the end that the story they made is just too private to be shared broadly. On the flip side, viewing audiences or readers are advised in advance when stories contain deeply sensitive material, and should be provided with opportunities to talk about what they have seen and heard. In addition, stories about highly sensitized or stigmatized topics should be shown only in carefully facilitated venues. We also ensure clarity and transparency among funders, partners, facilitators, and storytellers about workshops and story distribution goals and methods. We always make sure to advise of trigger warnings, both in-person sharing events as well as online if the stories are to be shared online. So for Chimba's story, I wouldn't show this without the trigger warning, and when and where it is shown online, it is accompanied by a written trigger warning and links to support for people who might need that. So for more information on our ethical practices, I'm going to provide Story Center's ethical guideline document on the Knowledge Center in the coming days. So finally, this is our chart about how stories might be used once they've been made. Just to be clear, the visual model we're looking at here, of course, there's lots of overlap between these circles, and they don't necessarily happen in any particular order. So stories can engage people on an emotional and intellectual level. They can bring new perspectives that can challenge the dominant way of thinking, break down stigma and stereotypes, and help build bridges and enable people to connect across difference. Finished stories in any format, be it written, recorded, video, whatever you choose to do, can be shared as training tools at community organizing events and in policy and advocacy arenas to promote learning and dialogue, capacity building, and support social justice and human rights, both locally and globally. Groups of stories can weave together a collective social story of injustice or struggle and can be examples of counter-narratives. A collection of stories can also tell the broader story of an organization and or shed light on a specific issue from various points of view. Stories are a great catalyst for getting a conversation started and can be used in support groups or conferences, presentations, or webinars like this one. So I'm going to go over the diagram one point at a time now. So first with this orange circle, personal reflection and growth, it looks at the impacts on storytellers of participating in a storytelling work or project. I'd also add that along with personal reflection and growth, it can also include leadership development. In the work I do specifically, our focus on first-person narrative recognizes that people often lack opportunities to share and bear witness to stories of their own struggles and successes, or to listen to the stories of others. A properly facilitated storytelling workshop of any kind offers a safe, supportive environment in which people from their teens to elders and from all walks of life can explore their histories and reflect on how they got to where they are. This is also a way to honor the life experiences of a storyteller and allow for reflection and transformation of the storyteller. The ability to describe lived experiences enables people to understand better their current interests and motivations in life and provides an amazing platform from which to engage people in addressing various social justice concerns and from which to build their skills as community leaders and advocates. In Shishimba's case, she was able to reflect on the things that happened to her in her past and how they have informed the person she is today and the work she has chosen to do. Similarly, in Michelle's case, she got to explore her identity and family history and connect it to the meaningful work she does today. So this blue one is education and awareness. Also looks at individual level change, but frames change as a potential result of listening to, watching, or reading stories. So it's on the audience or viewer or listener or reader of the story. Personal stories are immensely useful tools for supporting the transmission of information and skills. For example, digital stories created in our workshops stand out for their directness of emotional expression and for their ability to convey nuances of language and culture that can speak directly to specific audiences, and other forms of storytelling can do the same thing. Facts and timelines and third-person perspectives by experts can certainly be useful in describing an issue or problem, but personal stories, when properly contextualized, can bring to life the realities of how individuals experience that issue or problem day to day. When people see and hear a story that addresses silenced or stigmatized topics, their conception of what they can say or do shifts, and we've seen that this is where behavior change begins. For example, Shishimba's story helps audiences to view Shishimba as an agent of change as opposed to a victim. So the purple one is movement building, and it expands out to look at how sharing stories can support community-wide change. You could also call this community building and mobilization if you want. Without getting into a lot of theory, at Story Center, our work in community has really shown that with skillful facilitation, community story screenings can generate deep and strategic discussions about relevant issues and function as an opportunity to map out local strategies for how audience members can mobilize and take action on these issues. Stories can also build empathy and generate a cohesiveness that helps to bond a group together. This type of in-person story sharing can be supported by distributing stories online, via social media, through print methods, or on local radio to reinforce what people have seen and heard at events and reach larger audiences. If we connect all of this again to the social and behavior change communication, we know that when taken together, these kinds of strategies can contribute to achieving shifts away from unhealthy social and cultural norms and towards healthier views and norms. A group of storytellers can work together both in the workshop setting by developing bonds over shared experiences, as well as in how their collection of stories is shared. A collection of stories showcasing different entry points into a particular issue or theme can give viewers the chance to connect the dots, if you will, and create a bigger narrative around them, which is critical to building movements of change. Stories allow people to see what is possible, that change is possible, and that they are not necessarily alone in the fight. In the case of Adeline's story, she was part of a group of Latinx transgender women who have all struggled in their communities. The project, as I mentioned earlier, allowed them to come together and forge their own support system amongst each other. The group continues to work together and present their stories in various settings, from film festivals to universities, lectures, and conferences, to support groups to help change the narrative and stigma that surrounds this population. Another example, and I haven't shown a story from this, but I worked with a group of seniors in Thunder Bay called the Friendly Giants, and this project really brought together and forged a new supportive community amongst the storytelling participants. Having for the most part never met before, the group of 10 seniors now meet regularly, have become quite close. They help each other out in their daily lives. One storyteller, who was a newcomer from Pakistan who had moved to Thunder Bay to be with his daughter, really hadn't had the opportunity to meet people and make many friends since moving to Canada a few years before, and now has become very close with this group, and in particular has become good friends with one of the other gentlemen in the group. This next circle, the teal one, is policy and advocacy, and it describes the impact of that stories can have on a policy level. In an ideal world, people would have ample opportunity to express their concerns and needs, and their voices would directly inform public policy debates. Unfortunately, as we know, highly manipulated data and special interests tend to dominate in the policy realm. We found that stories created in our workshops can bring the concerns of those who are typically overlooked into the policy arena. Whether we're talking about public policy as in legislation at the local, provincial, or national level, or whether we're talking about institutional policies of health organizations, schools, or other civic or community groups. For example, my colleagues in the States did a project with Florida Youth Shines, which supports former foster youth, who are sharing their stories at the state and federal level to successfully advocate for improved laws for the children's system of care. So the youth made their stories and they took them to the Florida legislature, and people watched them, and they had a different perspective on what was going on, and they actually changed things at the policy level. Similarly, the Thunder Bay Friendly Giants project, which I just mentioned previously, was a way to gather information directly from seniors to assess how the organization could support and help seniors stay in their homes. It gave insight into what the storytellers needed to keep them safe and comfortable aging at home. And then the organization was able to act on those. Also, short stories seem to work well. The compact length of a digital story or short oral story or short blog piece has the ability to zero in on important issues. Being short makes them ideal for educating and influencing leaders and decision makers who may not typically have time to read a long story or watch a long video. And finally, we don't necessarily limit our attention to the value of policy change to the enactment of new policies. We have also seen that stories can be very useful as ways of informing the public about particular policy changes that have been enacted and how these changes may affect their lives, and that stories can contribute to training strategies intended to ensure that those responsible for policy enforcement are held accountable for their role. And the final circle here is the yellow one that looks at research and evaluation. So although research and evaluation approaches can play an important role in all four of these circles we've just gone over, Personal storytelling, and digital storytelling in particular, is becoming more and more common in academic, institutional, and organizational research, either as a qualitative methodology or form of data gathering or a way to analyze, assess, and/or evaluate programs. Stories can be used at the beginning of a project to assess the needs of the group, community, or population you'll be working with, and then make appropriate decisions moving forward. They can be used midway to look at where you've come from and what needs are being met and or what needs to change moving forward. They can also be used at the end of a project to evaluate the project or program to see how things went or to be used for reporting purposes. So a few tips for analyzing the stories. Number one, and I will again put these up on the Knowledge Center, you can group similar stories together. Are there themes that emerge? 2, you can think about representativeness. Are there typical or unique cases? 3, you can step back and look for patterns. Are there connections between events? Are a number of people saying the same thing? If you're using visuals, how often do certain images appear? 4, you can describe the patterns in writing. How do the patterns relate back to your program? 5, you can ask colleagues for input. Do others see the same thing? Are there different interpretations? In addition, I'd like to add that not only are many nonprofit organizations using their stories for one or more of the above mentioned reasons, but they're also using them for fundraising campaigns and to show funders. Stories can be a persuasive way to speak to funders and clients. These short personal stories can be shared to bring attention to issues as part of a fundraising campaign, to humanize issues and make it easier and more accessible for potential donors to connect with an issue and the people it affects. Stories can help make your case to a potential funder. And then after a project is completed, they can be shown to funders to show how money was spent and the positive impacts and effects their money has had on a community, group of people, or organization. But, and I can't stress this enough, with all these uses, it is imperative that the storytellers are always respected and kept safe. As we went over in the ethical guidelines earlier, storytellers and audiences alike must never feel that someone's story is being exploited. And while there is a fine line, the more closely organizations work with their storytellers, the better they can ensure that this won't happen. The storytellers need to be involved, constantly giving and revisiting consent and helping to make decisions on where, how, and when their stories can be shared. Stories can be a very powerful tool to be used in so many ways for various purposes, if collected and shared respectfully and ethically. And most of all, people like to tell and listen to stories, so they're an amazing way to engage people from all walks of life.